The Appalachian preacher too wicked for history books, Ezekiel Crain 63. You think you know what a corrupt preacher looks like. The archetype is familiar. The man who uses the pulpit to accumulate money or influence, who exploits the trust of frightened people who have given their faith to the wrong vessel. It is a story as old as organized religion, and it has been told enough times that most people believe they would recognize it. They would see the patterns. They would know to leave. What the congregation of Ezekiel Crain in Breathitt County, Kentucky, did not understand, what they could not have understood from anything that came before, was that what Crain was building had nothing to do with money or power in any form that history had prepared them to recognize. He was 63 years old when the pattern became impossible to deny. He had been in Breathitt County for 22 years, and in those 22 years, through a process so slow and so carefully managed that no one standing inside it could see its shape from where they stood, he had constructed something in that hollow church that was entirely his own. A theology, a community, and a mechanism that had no precedent in any denomination and no remedy in any law that existed for that place and time. Drop your location in the comments before we go further. This case comes from a county that people in Kentucky still call Bloody Breathitt, and by the time this account is finished, you will understand one more reason why that name was earned. Breathitt County in the latter decades of the 19th century was a place outsiders understood primarily through newspaper accounts of the feuds, the long grinding cycles of retaliatory violence that had given the county its reputation. What those accounts rarely captured was the texture of ordinary life in the hollows between the feud events. The daily existence of farming families who were not participants in any feud, but who lived within its atmosphere the way people live inside weather they did not choose. Church was the primary institution for those families. The mechanism for spiritual orientation, practical support, resolution of disputes, the marking of all occasions that required communal acknowledgement. A church in that country was not a Sunday gathering. It was everything, which meant that a preacher had a scope of access to people's lives that no single figure in any more urbanized community would accumulate. He knew what the doctor and the lawyer and the schoolteacher knew combined. He knew it earlier and more completely, because people told him what they told no one else. Ezekiel Crain arrived in Breathitt County in 1868, 41 years old, presenting credentials from a Baptist association in eastern Tennessee that, when later investigated, could confirm his attendance at 2 annual meetings but no formal ordination. He carried a letter of introduction from a minister in Harlan County that spoke warmly of his character, without specifying any act through which that character had demonstrated itself. He settled in the community of Frozen Creek, in the northern part of the county, and within 8 months had organized a congregation in a single room building the community's men built on donated land. He was, by every surviving account from that period, a commanding presence. 6 feet tall, narrow-shouldered, with the posture of a man who understood the importance of being fully seen when he stood before people. His voice was the detail most specifically recalled, low and resonant, with a quality of controlled intensity that made listeners feel he was addressing them alone regardless of the room's size. His eyes, in the description given by a woman named Callie Watts to a church investigator in 1891, were the deep brown of creek mud after a flood, and they fixed on you in a way that felt less like being observed and more like being read at a depth you had not authorized. His preaching style was unremarkable at first. Fire and redemption in the Mountain Baptist tradition. The text, the emotional vocabulary, the rhythms of escalation and release. People came. The congregation grew. By 1875, it was the largest in that part of the county. For 7 years, nothing would have flagged to a careful observer as other than a successful ministry in a context where successful ministries were common and valued. The first sign came in 1878. A young man named Garrett Sells, 19 years old, one of Crain's most visibly devoted congregants, left the church without explanation, and refused to discuss his reasons with anyone. His family attributed it to the temperament of youth. Garrett Sells left Breathitt County entirely in 1880. A church investigator who located him in Indiana in 1891 found a man who declined to return to Breathitt County for any purpose and said only that the man running the church in Frozen Creek was not what he had presented himself to be, and that Sells had nothing further to say in any form that could be quoted or attributed. The 1891 investigation originated from the Baptist Association in Lexington, which had received a letter, anonymous, written in a hand the association's secretary described as educated and female, alleging that Crain's practices had departed from Christian doctrine in ways the letter writer was unwilling to specify in writing, but which she described as demanding examination by someone with both the authority and the courage to act on what they found. The association sent a man named Preacher Aldous Hicks, a pragmatic itinerant minister with 15 years of evaluating irregular practices. He spent 2 weeks in Frozen Creek. He attended 3 services. He conducted private interviews with 11 congregation members. He submitted a report to the association board, marked confidential. The board received it and did not act. Hicks himself, 2 years later, in a letter to his own minister in Lexington, wrote that he had seen things at the Crain Church that he had prayed about daily since his return, and that he was no longer certain whether the failure to act made him a coward or a rational man who understood that no institutional mechanism available was adequate to what he had observed. He did not describe what he had observed. His minister's follow-up letter asking for specifics went unanswered. Hicks died in 1897. His papers, left to a nephew, were burned in a house fire in 1901. By the mid-1880s, a pattern was visible to anyone who had known the congregation long enough to compare its present form to what it had been at the beginning. People who joined the church and remained active members for more than 2 years developed a particular quality in their behavior when Crain was in the room, an orientation toward him that went beyond respect or devotion into something more like the attention of a person waiting for instruction before taking any action. They checked his face before they answered questions. They modified their positions based on what they read in his expression while they spoke. Newcomers to the community noticed this immediately. Old-timers who had watched it develop gradually noticed it only when newcomers pointed it out, and then were disturbed by how long they had been looking at it without registering what it was. A physician named Ezra Clare, who came to Frozen Creek in 1887, wrote to a colleague in Lexington in 1889 that he had observed among a significant portion of Crain's congregation a behavioral profile he had previously only encountered in individual patients being treated for certain psychiatric conditions. The unusual quality was that in those patients the profile was individual, arising from internal processes specific to each person. In the congregation, it appeared simultaneously in a large group of otherwise healthy adults, suggesting to Clare that the cause was external and environmental rather than internal and constitutional. He did not publish this observation. He filed it in his personal notes and continued practicing. In the spring of 1891, a woman named Lena Dawson died in childbirth at 22 years of age. She was a congregation member. Her husband Warren had never joined the church. He had lived at the edge of the Frozen Creek community for 3 years without joining because, as he told the county sheriff, something about Crain had always felt wrong to him in a way he could not articulate and had learned not to argue with. When his wife died, and the community's response to her death included elements Warren Dawson did not recognize as belonging to any Christian tradition, rituals at the graveside, words spoken in a form he could not identify, Crain's hand placed deliberately on the soil above the coffin, in a gesture the entire congregation watched without any apparent surprise. Warren Dawson wrote out a statement that night and brought it to the sheriff the following morning. He brought not only an account of the graveside ritual, but a detailed list of behavioral changes he had observed in his wife over the preceding 18 months of her membership. changes in her responses to questions, changes in her relationship to her own preferences and opinions, changes in the quality of her attention when Crain was present or when his name was mentioned. Sheriff Jacob Fields, who was not himself a congregation member and who had noted the congregation's behavioral changes over years without finding grounds to act, found in Warren Dawson's written account the specific grounding he had been lacking. He went to the church on a Thursday evening. What he found was not a midweek prayer meeting in any sense he recognized. The room was lit only by oil lamps arranged in a formation Fields described in his report as deliberate and purposeful. Crain was speaking in a language Fields did not know and later could not identify. The congregation sat with a uniformity of posture, back straight, hands on knees, head slightly inclined, that Fields described as the posture of people in receipt rather than in prayer. The room held a smell he noted but could not name. When he announced himself, every member of the congregation turned to look at Crain before they turned to look at him. Every one. The movement was uniform and simultaneous. Crain was arrested. He did not resist. He was tried in the autumn of 1891 on charges of conducting fraudulent religious practices, the only applicable legal instrument available. The trial was unusual in several respects. Congregation members testifying in his defense delivered their testimony with a quality the prosecutor in his closing argument described as rote, as though they were reciting prepared statements rather than speaking from memory. When pressed with follow-up questions their prepared statements had not addressed, several witnesses appeared to lose the thread entirely and then restart from the beginning of the same statement, as though a mechanism had reset. Crain himself offered no defense testimony. He sat through the proceedings with the composure of a man watching something that did not concern him. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he said, "There is nothing this court has the authority to reverse." He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years. He served 3 and was released in 1894. He left Breathitt County. He does not appear in census, vital, or legal records for Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia in any year following his release. The church at Frozen Creek was burned by local families the summer after his release. In a deliberate, organized action the county made no attempt to prosecute. The congregation dispersed across several counties. A welfare inquiry conducted in 1895 by a church women's organization found a significant number of former congregation members experiencing what the inquiry described as a difficult personal transition, an unusual passivity in daily life, difficulty initiating action without external direction, sustained anxiety in the absence of an authority figure providing instruction. The inquiry recommended prayer and community support. It did not attempt to explain the cause. The inquiry's author, a woman named Margaret Trent from Louisville, wrote in a private letter to her supervisor that she had been conducting welfare inquiries for 6 years and had never encountered anything like what she found in those former congregants. She wrote that they reminded her of people who had been somewhere and come back from it changed in ways they could not describe to people who had not been there. She did not publish this characterization. The letter is in the church women's organization archive, uncatalogued until 2011. Aldous Hicks's confidential report to the Baptist Association has not been found. The association's archive from the 1890s is largely intact for all other correspondence from that period. The report was received and logged. It does not appear in any subsequent inventory. Warren Dawson's written statement, the document the sheriff read, the list of behavioral changes observed across 18 months of Crain's influence on his wife, is listed in the trial evidence log. It is not in the physical trial file at the Breathitt County Courthouse. A researcher who examined the file in 1998 found the evidence log entry. The underlying document was absent. What the Crain congregation was being made into, what Hughes Crain intended for people in that particular state of patient, waiting dependency, is not answered in any available document. The congregation was not being directed toward an external outcome. They were simply being changed. The change itself appeared to be the goal, and Crain, when the court gave him the opportunity to speak, said the court had no authority to reverse it, not because he was defiant, because he considered it a true statement of fact. Was Ezekiel Crain a man who cynically engineered psychological dependency through techniques available to any sufficiently cold manipulator? Or was he a man who genuinely believed that what he was building in that darkened room on Thursday evenings was something that required his congregation's participation in a form that had no name in Christian tradition because it was older? The distance between those two possibilities is narrower than it should be. A cynical manipulator builds toward a goal he can name. What Crain built does not suggest a nameable external goal. The direction of the change he produced, the passivity, the dependency, the uniform turning of faces toward him before turning toward anything else, suggests that the change was the finished product, not a means to something further. And if that is true, the question of what the finished product was for has no available answer. Drop it in the comments. Manipulator or believer? Something that fits neither category. I want to know where you land. Some men use the pulpit to accumulate what they want. Some use it for something older than wanting. The mountains drew both kinds. They kept the records of neither very well. If this is the kind of case that does not let you sleep cleanly, subscribe. There are more of them waiting. Keep your doors locked and your eyes open. There is a detail about the Crain trial that most accounts pass over because it appears in the transcript only as a procedural note and requires knowing the conventions of 1891 Breathitt County court procedure to understand what it signals. During the testimony of the fourth defense witness, a woman named Ada Combs, who had been in the congregation for 6 years, the court reporter's notation reads, "Witness paused for approximately 3 minutes before resuming from the beginning." This is not a description of a witness collecting herself. It is not a description of a witness becoming emotional and needing a moment. The notation is the court reporter's documentation of the phenomenon the prosecutor later described in his closing argument, the resetting. The moment where the prepared statement runs out, the thread dissolves, and the witness begins again at the top as though the intervening exchange had not occurred. 3 minutes. The court reporter timed it. For 3 minutes, Ada Combs sat in the witness chair and did not speak and did not appear to be formulating a response. And then she began again from the beginning of what she had been saying. The defense attorney did not object to the notation. The judge did not comment on it. The court reporter wrote it down because it had occurred, and because the court reporter's job was to write down what occurred. This is one witness at one trial in 1891. 12 congregation members testified in Crain's defense across that trial. A researcher who examined the full transcript in 2005 found similar notations beside the testimony of 7 of those 12. The pauses ranged from 90 seconds to 4 minutes. 7 of 12 witnesses, all women, all resetting to the beginning after a period of silence that the court reporter documented with the mechanical accuracy of a person who did not have a framework for what they were recording, but knew something was happening that should be written down. The court did not address it. The judge used his phrase about public decency twice in the sentencing summary and moved on. Crain served his 3 years and left. And whatever he was building in those people, whatever he was growing in those women who sat in a dark room on Thursday evenings in receipt of something that made them reset at a defense table in Whitesburg in 1891, went with him. In whatever form 22 years of careful construction had produced, to whatever county gave him the next opportunity to build. He left Breathitt County in 1894 with 3 years of incarceration behind him and 22 years of practice before that. He was 63 years old. Old enough that some people who heard the case assumed the story was finished, that a man of that age, convicted, released, and displaced, would live out whatever years remained to him without the capacity or the opportunity to begin again. What those people did not account for is that what Crane had been doing in Frozen Creek did not require youth or physical strength or novelty. It required time and patience, and a particular kind of attention that prison did not diminish, and that age alone would not have taken from him. And it required a community that had not yet been exposed to him. In 1894, there were dozens of such communities within a day's ride of any point in eastern Kentucky. There were hundreds within a week's travel. Whether he found one, and whether he spent another decade building in it the same careful way he had built in Frozen Creek before anyone thought to ask Aldous Hicks to look, that question has no answer in any available archive. What it has is the shape of a man who said at his sentencing that the court had no authority to reverse what he had done, and who then walked out of a penitentiary 900 days later and vanished.